Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about how the Dutch government ruined 26,000 lives and the collapse of the Dutch coalition government. The Dutch government has fallen in the wake of the childcare benefits scandal, where it was uncovered that the Dutch government had falsely accused 26,000 people of welfare fraud, forcing them to pay back thousands of euros, putting them on fraud blacklists, and plunging them into financial ruin. On top of that, it was revealed that many of the victims were targeted based on their ethnic background. As a result, Prime Minister Mark Rutte and the entire cabinet has resigned. Yet this comes just 2 months before the elections, and many of these politicians are likely to be re-elected. How did it come to this? How was it possible for the Dutch government to mess up so badly? And how will this affect the upcoming general election? All that in this video. Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos every week and hit that bell notification while you're at it. Unprecedented injustice. Now in the Netherlands, the tax authority, basically the Dutch version of the IRS, is both responsible for collecting taxes and for distributing those taxes in the form of various social programs. One of these is the childcare allowance, which subsidizes daycare for working parents, allowing them to go out to work while their children are looked after. The amount you get is dependent on your income. It was people who were receiving this childcare allowance who ended up being the victims of this injustice. The childcare benefits scandal in the Netherlands has been a slow-moving catastrophe. But it came to a head in December when the parliamentary report was released, entitled Ongekend Onrecht, or Unprecedented Injustice. This report detailed how the tax authority had been grossly negligent and disproportionately harsh when tackling welfare fraud. So much so that between 2013 and 2019, 26,000 recipients of childcare allowance were falsely accused of fraud. These people were forced to pay back years' worth of benefits, had their possessions repossessed, wages withdrawn, many lost their jobs, lost their homes, families were torn apart, they were put on fraud blacklists which prevented them from getting loans or applying for debt relief, and some even committed suicide. So it's no surprise that after much pressure, the coalition government was forced to resign. But to understand how the Dutch tax authority went on such a vicious witch hunt for welfare fraud, we have to understand the political context. The origins of this scandal lie in a previous scandal: the Bulgarian Fraud. In 2013, it was revealed that Bulgarian gangs had encouraged Bulgarians to visit the Netherlands temporarily to apply for childcare allowance worth thousands of euros, and then go back to Bulgaria before they could be caught. Images filled people's TV screens of Bulgarian villagers waving around bank cards and bragging about their ability to defraud the Dutch government. This abuse of the Dutch welfare state understandably angered people, and there had to be a political response. So there was a massive push to fight fraud, and politicians from across the political spectrum tried to outdo each other, making proposals that could tackle this issue in the harshest way possible. What was missed in all this enthusiasm to fight welfare fraud was that the Bulgarian fraud amounted to just 5.6 million euros. If you add other fraud cases, that's just 16.8 million euros out of 68 billion euros of total benefits paid out between 2007 and 2013. In other words, this issue, which was receiving the attention of all the media and politicians, amounted to just 0.02% of all benefits paid out. Now that doesn't mean it wasn't a problem, but these criminals were already being investigated under existing laws and went to jail for it. But that wasn't enough. And so 25 million euros was invested in extra controls to fight a fraud problem that amounted to just 16.8 million euros. And so the tax authority had to find other ways to earn this money back. So rather than fighting actual fraud, which was just 0.02% of all welfare payments, the tax authority began punishing people for minor administrative mistakes. People might have made a small mistake in calculating their income, or perhaps a spelling mistake. These kind of bureaucratic errors are common in all countries, but the tax authority set about targeting these people as fraudsters. Now, the key thing to understand is that when people apply for various social benefits, they apply online and with tax information that is not always up to date. So people's eligibility is not always checked immediately, and if someone's income ends up being higher or lower in the next fiscal year, they might need to pay back some money or receive extra. It's impossible to check the eligibility of millions of people, and so samples are taken to check for fraud. So basically what happened is that people who made minor administrative mistakes received a level of benefit that was too high and were then forced to pay it back all in one go, plus fines, and labeled as fraudsters, when they had simply made a minor mistake in filling a complicated form. And so a massively disproportionate response was created for a relatively small problem. The media and politicians jumped on this issue to start a witch hunt against a fraud epidemic that didn't really exist. And the tax authority operated with extreme harshness and no room for nuance, targeting people for fraud when they just made small administrative errors, which the tax authority itself sometimes makes as well. And this was because the law was made so harsh as to not leave any room for exceptions or nuances. But that wasn't all. Ethnic discrimination. Because of the Bulgarian fraud, the tax authority felt the need to create several risk categories. People who fell into these risk categories were more likely to be checked for fraud. One of these categories was nationality, and this was done, of course, to prevent something like the Bulgarian fraud from happening again. But it's critical to understand that those Bulgarian fraudsters were not Dutch citizens and had only one nationality, Bulgarian. But it didn't stop there. It wasn't just people with a single foreign nationality being targeted, but Dutch citizens who held dual nationality, such as being American and Dutch, or Turkish and Dutch. In other words, the Dutch tax authority was making a distinction between Dutch citizens based on national origin. Keep in mind that for some countries like Turkey and Morocco, it is extremely difficult to get rid of your citizenship, and so there are plenty of Dutch people who have been here for 2 or 3 generations who still have dual nationality. And so out of the 26,000 victims, 11,000 were singled out for special scrutiny specifically because they had dual nationality. That's over 40% of the total. Unsurprisingly, this disproportionately targeted Dutch people with a migrant background. What makes things worse is that out of the 5 risk categories created by the tax authority, if someone met 4 out of the 5 risk criteria but did not have a dual nationality, they were not checked. In other words, this wasn't just about the perceived risk of people with a dual nationality, it was de facto ethnic discrimination. The tax authority did not check people who met the other 4 risk criteria but didn't have dual nationality, but it did check people who did not meet those criteria but did have a dual nationality. That's the reason they were targeted. Not only is this method of control discriminatory, it is self-reinforcing. You see, if you disproportionately check people with a migrant background, then by definition, you will find more guilty people among those with a migrant background, which causes you to do even more checks on those with a migrant background. Except these people weren't even guilty. It's the same false logic used to justify stop and frisk policies in the United States. What's more, this is illegal. Article 1 of the Dutch Constitution states that in equal circumstances, people must be treated equally. Discrimination is illegal. The tax authority violated our constitution. This is not about left-wing identity politics, it's about institutional discrimination. But what allowed the tax authority to continue these practices for years on end? The Rutte Doctrine. Much of it has to do with the way information about this issue was systematically hidden from the public and from Parliament. This is known as the Rutte Doctrine, which was the belief of Prime Minister Mark Rutte that civil servants should be able to speak openly about things without them being made public. But in practice, this Rutte Doctrine amounted to hiding information and not writing anything down in order to avoid a paper trail so that the government cannot be held accountable. And this lack of transparency is exactly what happened with the child benefit scandal. The tax authority systematically withheld information that would have exonerated victims whom they knew to be innocent. They even used fake evidence to prove their case. And when the Data Protection Authority tried to investigate whether the tax office was using dual nationality as a selection criteria, the tax authority actively resisted being investigated. They even suspended an internal whistleblower. Victims who were targeted did not get any response to requests for information, and their letters were ignored. In fact, already in 2017, the National Ombudsman recommended compensation for the victims, but these recommendations were ignored. And while all this happened, senior ministers were aware of what was happening. This included Lodewijk Asscher, Minister of Social Affairs until recently, leader of the center-left Labour Party, who was part of the coalition at the time. It also included Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who is still leader of the center-right pro-business VVD. All this was done to avoid the scrutiny that is necessary in a functioning democracy. It was only through the work of investigative reporters that the true extent of what was happening was exposed. And so, in light of the catastrophic failure of our democratic institutions, what are the political and legal ramifications, and how will this affect the upcoming elections? Political consequences. Politically speaking, heads have rolled. Starting in 2019, the Minister of Finance, Menno Snell, resigned. Then, when the parliamentary report came out in December 2020, it exposed the role of more current and former ministers. After much pressure, Labour Party leader and former Minister of Social Affairs, Lodewijk Asscher, resigned as party leader. This then put pressure on Mark Rutte, who as Prime Minister is ultimately responsible, but he initially refused to resign. So then, the leader of the Green Left Party threatened a vote of no confidence in the government. And so to avoid the embarrassment this would bring, the coalition government composed of the pro-business VVD of Mark Rutte, the Christian Democratic CDA, the Christian Union, and the Social Liberal D66 collectively resigned. However, they will stay on as a caretaker government to handle the coronavirus until elections. Yet while politicians have resigned from the government, with the exception of Labour Party leader Asscher, they have not resigned as party leaders. After the elections in March, they will probably be re-elected, and so really all that has changed was a symbolic resignation. As the polls currently stand, the VVD party of Mark Rutte is expected to win around 38 seats, or 25% of the vote, making them the largest party in the country. Essentially, the government is shielded from political consequences by its popularity around the coronavirus response. But aside from political consequences, there must surely be legal consequences. Defrauding thousands of people and engaging in institutional discrimination, which is a violation of Article 1 of the Constitution, must be punished, and there must be restitution for the victims. After much pressure, compensation was announced of 500 million euros, or 30,000 euros per person, plus more for those who need it. However, initially it was discovered that much of the compensation would go toward paying back creditors, and the number one creditor is the tax authority. This kind of incompetence is typical of this entire scandal. Fortunately, after this controversy, all debts owed to public institutions have now been forgiven. Yet it could take until May 2021 for people to actually receive the full compensation package. It seems that the tax authority wasted no time plunging people into debt, but drags its feet when it comes to paying compensation. Unsurprisingly, no criminal charges will be brought against tax officials, and the tax authority itself is immune from prosecution. They are getting away with murder. However, the tax authority will be broken up and separated into a department paying out benefits and a department collecting taxes. This makes sense. A tax agency has an incentive to try and get as much money as possible from citizens, which is exactly the opposite of what you need when paying out benefits, and probably explains some of the harshness and rigidity of its behavior. Yet aside from the political and legal consequences or lack thereof, there is a wider lesson in this whole affair. Take a look at this graph of different types of fraud in the Netherlands. Right at the bottom, you have benefit fraud at 86 million euros. At the top, you have tax fraud and money laundering at 8.3 billion and 18.3 billion euros annually. Now take a look at this. In blue, you have the amount of media attention for these different kinds of fraud. And you see that by far the most media attention goes to the smallest problem. We have allowed politicians and the media to lead us to focus on the tiny percentage of fraud done by working class people, while the real fraudsters, who are rich and powerful, are never tackled. The Netherlands allowed itself to go on a witch hunt for a problem that barely existed, while the big fish got off scot-free and our democratic institutions were undermined. And this time, it destroyed thousands of lives. My next video will be on the massive farmers' protests taking place in India, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.